All right.
All right, everyone. Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me for this rerun of our faculty development presentation on facilitating small group discussions. So very excited to be here with all of you today. And for those of you who are watching the recording, I definitely hope that this information will be useful to all of you. So a little bit about me. So most of you know me. I am Dr. Joel Ariza Zavala, and I'm the Executive Director for Equity, Inclusion, Diversity, and Partnership at CUSM. I'm also an assistant professor of medical education and trained educator here. I have my PhD in education. And so this opportunity to facilitate a faculty development program around this was very exciting to me. And I'm very excited to share all this information with you today. Just as a quick introduction, the purpose of this workshop is really to serve as a broad overview. I will have an opportunity to share strategies, techniques, facilitation guidelines with all of you, but know that if there are any particular strategies that are of interest to you that you want to go in depth into, then I'm available, via email, Teams, to set up a meeting either in person or virtually, so we could discuss some of these facilitation techniques in a little bit more in depth. That one-on-one or maybe even a small group regarding that would be incredibly beneficial, not only for me, but I think for some of the faculty who really want to learn some of these skills. So once again, really excited to be here with all of you today. All right, so here's just a quick overview of what the presentation is going to entail. So first, we're going to define what it means to be a small group and look at small group facilitation. Then I have an exercise at the very end of the workshop that I have prepared for everyone. So I'll talk a little bit and share with you what I want all of you as participants to be prepared to do at the very end. Afterwards, we're going to take a look at our objectives, or looking at understanding the objectives associated with small group discussions. We'll talk about specific practices. So when looking at, this is kind of the outward view when we are facilitating with, small groups, students and other learners. Then I'll talk a little bit about facilitation techniques, which is sort of the internal world, as I call it, as the faculty member, as the instructor, as a facilitator of small groups. And then last but not least, this exercise that we're planning for is really looking through and implementing, where all of you will be able to share examples, questions, and I will facilitate in real time for all of you, what this could potentially look like. So really excited to be able to do all of this with you today. All right, so let's do some quick definitions. So small group instruction, the grouping of 2 to 15 students or participants together for the purposes of honoring learning needs and growing knowledge and skills in an area of particular importance. So typically when you look at the research on small group facilitation, usually it'll say 2 to 6, but especially within the higher education setting and within professional learning communities, such as faculty development, it's not uncommon to have groups, maybe upwards of 15. And so for me, I like to be flexible with the definition of what is a small group. And so I define it as 2 to 15 participants. Once it gets larger than 15, facilitation can be a little bit difficult, especially if you're a solo facilitator or solo teacher or educator or faculty member in that group. However, if you have a co-facilitator or co-facilitators, you could easily engage in what would still be considered small group discussion and small group rapport building with groups around the size of 20 and 25. So really, it just depends. The small group facilitation is really about, in some ways, the ratio of facilitators to the group, because small group facilitation is about building relationships and rapport and diving deep into understanding, the learning objectives and the learning needs of students. So at the end of the workshop, here's what I'd like everyone to prepare for. So at the end of the workshop, I'm going to be facilitating in real time, as I mentioned a few moments ago. And so in preparation for that final sort of piece of engagement, I want everyone to think through examples of when you facilitated small groups, maybe things that went well or things that you would have hoped would have gone better. I want you to be prepared with some questions that you have for me around how to implement some of these practices that I'll mention in the presentation. I'm particularly interested in previous struggles. All of us, including myself, have had struggles around small group facilitation. And even to this day, despite that I've been facilitating small groups and been in this area for almost a decade now, I experience struggles, because every time you enter a small group with new participants, new learners, new colleagues, there's the uniqueness of each group and each individual person that's introduced into the facilitation. And so it's not uncommon to have struggles that are in the past, but also in the present, even for skilled facilitators. So I think it's really important for us to normalize that there's struggles and they're going to be present. Oftentimes, over time, it gets easier for sure. So really the struggles that we see become much less, intense over time. I want folks to also share concerns that you have about facilitating small groups. How do you ensure effective learning, in this type of situation? What are the role of case studies, which is an example of small group facilitation techniques that we'll talk about today? Those sorts of things. I'd also love people to maybe talk about some of your learning goals associated with facilitating small groups, maybe through examples that you have from courses that you've been teaching. What are your learning goals regarding small group facilitation? And I can go into depth with you on some of those learning goals that you have as an individual faculty member. And then last, but very important, is the hopes. What are some hopes or goals or dreams that you have around small group facilitation that you'd be able to do? Where do you see yourself 6 months from now or a year from now as far as the small group facilitation techniques are concerned? So take a quick look at this once again and just sort of take mental note or physical notes if you have your computer or notepad available. And examples, questions, previous struggles, concerns, learning goals, and then hopes. So come prepared with one or more of these at the very end of our workshop so that we can facilitate a discussion together. All right, so let's understand the overall objectives of small group facilitation and learning. So small group facilitation is useful in achieving many learning and engagement goals, including but not limited to the following. It helps us develop stronger rapport with our learners. It supports diverse learning needs of people. And so especially the transition from maybe didactic and large group into small group is a really great way for folks to, maybe have better trust in a small group or not feel so intimidated to speak up in a larger group setting. And maybe small groups allow them to speak up and share thoughts or knowledge in a way that feels much more conducive to sort of their personality or their learning style. So supporting diverse learning needs of people is definitely a standard objective or goal of small group facilitation. It also has the opportunity to promote creativity and innovation. When we're looking at working in small groups, people can go into depth on a specific subject or with specific subject matter. And so that's really crucial and something that I particularly value about small group facilitation. What the research also shows that there's longer retention of subject matter, especially if it's facilitated around specific content or content objectives. And so people are able to remember, their experiences and the knowledge that was shared in these smaller groups for much longer. Another important piece that I love in particular is agency and ownership of learning. Small group facilitation and small groups allow people to just have, more buy-in in the learning process, be able to shift conversations in good ways. Of course, facilitation, right, as the purpose of this workshop suggests, is needed because sometimes small groups can go off task, so to speak, and that's normal. Sometimes, oftentimes, at least based in my experience, small groups will be able to come back, right, to the main objective, when given a quick prompt or a reminder to do so. So, okay, agency and ownership of learning, for the most part, that's a really great thing. And every so often, we may need to redirect or realign folks. It increases self-awareness, so who am I in relationship to this knowledge that's being discussed or presented? Who am I in relationship to this data that we're analyzing? Who am I in relationship to the people around me? Also the development of interpersonal skills. And so even for individuals who may be more introverted, such as myself, except when I'm in an educational context, I want to develop interpersonal skills. And so it's important for both introverts and extroverted individuals or other personality types to learn how to connect and communicate and integrate what they're learning with and among other people, right? What does it mean to sort of speak less and listen more? What does it mean to speak more and maybe listen less, right? Those are the sorts of things that are important objectives in this process. It also gives us an opportunity to reduce intimidation from a large group dynamic. And then lastly, it's wisdom building from different perspectives. And so how often, hopefully in our experience, we've had small group facilitations where we've either facilitated ourselves or we've been a participant. And we realize, oh my goodness, regarding this specific topic, people are coming at it from different perspectives, right? Knowledge and truth and scientific knowledge, for example, may be objective and static, but the pathway that people get to that knowledge can be and should be very different. And so when we're talking about wisdom building, it's, oh, how did you learn about this concept? Well, maybe you learned about it in a formal course at a university, whereas others may have learned about it in a professional setting, on the job. Maybe someone was thrown into a situation where they had to learn a specific skill or specific content or knowledge. And so that's how they came about their learning. And as a result of the pathway that they've taken, even to objective scientific knowledge, they have differing perspectives because maybe there's pieces of the knowledge that elements of the knowledge acquisition that others may not have because of the process or the pathway they took to get there. So I think that's really important, is that wisdom building piece. And it should be a central objective, along all of these in regards to small group facilitation. So let's go ahead and go into sample small group facilitation practices. So this is the outward view. These are the things as facilitators that we do within and for and among our small groups. So the first one is case study. So case studies are a really great way to have structured formal learning that provides learning from the past. And so case studies, whether they're connected to clinical case studies, non-clinical case studies, scientific case studies, research case studies, whatever makes sense for you as an individual faculty member and for the type of research and teaching that you do. Case studies are a really great way to have structured small group facilitation. And so here's where you introduce the case study, right? And you provide learning objectives for the students. You're transparent about what that would look like and what your hopes are for learning outcomes. And then students are able to use the case study to guide their conversation and to guide their learning. Case studies are really great because of that structured piece, right? Case studies, are also a great beginning point for individuals who may not have done as much small group facilitation in the past, but you're interested in doing more. Go ahead and start with case studies because it'll provide you that scaffolded in structure that you may need to feel more successful and to build your skill set over time. Another really important group facilitation practice is open sharing, right? And this is where we get a sense as facilitators, pre-existing understanding or pre-existing knowledge regarding a specific piece of content or knowledge development or skill development piece that we're facilitating in the classroom or even in the professional learning setting. And so open share is basically, hey, to the group, share with me a little bit about what you know about this concept or this idea or this topic. How did you come to learn about that? Was that learning experience positive for you? Was it a challenging learning experience? Did you feel that it was smooth or was it an uphill battle? All the different ways that, or all the different ways and all the pieces of language that we could use to prompt open share and give people a little bit of structure so that they know what you're asking of them. But really open share is tell me a little bit about what you know from the past. And then the opportunity for the facilitator is, let me figure out how to connect the dots here to build stronger knowledge content outcomes for my learners. Another piece, another practice piece is reflection, which really is about the internal experience. Reflection is a great way to check in with participants and ask them, how is this learning experience going for you? What is positive to you about this learning experience? What challenges are you having in regard to maybe the small group discussion? How is this beneficial to you? What are some of those challenges that you have, like I mentioned earlier? And how could we overcome some of those challenges? What are some things that I as a facilitator could do to improve the learning experience and potentially the learning outcomes of this small group? And so reflection is give participants an opportunity to look inward, right? To reflect on their internal experience and discuss struggles, right? Struggles as well as triumphs or strengths from the small group process. So a couple more facilitation practices include the deep dive, which is something that I really love. It could be through a case study if you want a structured piece, or it can be through open share. And this is where you hone in on a very, very specific piece of content, piece of knowledge acquisition, or a specific case study or experience. And you ask students to dive really deep into it. And by that, I mean at least two things. Number one, the deep dive is about acquiring new, reliable and trustworthy knowledge regarding a specific piece of importance, right? If it's a clinical skill, instead of introducing how to do the clinical skill, just right off the bat, maybe in a didactic model, rather you have the students using their computers and an internet source or a search source and have them find credible resources, of course, that allow them to deep dive and first, develop some understanding on their own. And then it helps them not only have some agency in that process, going back to some of the learning objectives from earlier, but it also allows them to do some of the work themselves. That agency allows for greater learning. And then you as an educator, faculty member, facilitator can then sort of say, all right, what did you find out? Was there any conflicting information out there? Now, let me go ahead and go into a didactic mode and let me share with you, best practices around how to implement this clinical skill effectively, right? And so even though you may be revisiting knowledge, because you're doing it in two modalities, maybe large group and then small group, it does support students in learning. And that's really, really important because we want to strengthen their understanding of something specific. Give me just a moment. So another thing that's really important is knowledge check. And so when you're doing small group facilitations, feel free to do check-ins with folks. And the check-ins can be, okay, we've been discussing X topic for the last, 8 minutes. Let's go ahead and do a quick check-in. What have you learned? What do you understand to be true? What is conflicting information out there? What do you know about this subject matter or this piece of content that you didn't know before we're coming into the small group discussion, right? And so knowledge check and doing that specifically is how are the students engaging with, understanding the objectives of this particular class, right? Or this particular experience. So love knowledge check. One of the ways that you can facilitate this effectively is, reduce and just be very transparent about reducing the stigma associated with maybe having a wrong answer, right? Because small group facilitation is not only about ensuring understanding of content, but it's also about that rapport piece. And so in order for students to utilize small group discussions effectively, a facilitator needs to create a space of safety. And one of the best ways that you can create a space of safety is by being transparent that there are no right or wrong answers initially, right? Reduce the stress of sort of having to perform perfectly, and then say, let's facilitate, maybe some of the misconceptions later on. And that's very important. Creating that psychological safety and that rapport with the students helps for greater learning outcomes in the end. Design is another practice where, maybe you introduce a case study or a problem that's emerged from the field, and you give it to students and you say, how would you address this differently? What would you do differently? And so really design pieces are about creating new solutions and giving learners an opportunity to do that in a small group first before you discuss them either as a large group or as part of another course or workshop. So I love design because it's a creative element that's introduced to small group facilitation. All right, so 3 more practices that I want to go over with you, and then I'm going to do a check-in with all of you and give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So check-in is the next one, right? And so that's where you pause the learning and you sort of say, okay, what are your reactions or questions to the information that I just shared with you? And so I'm actually going to do that with you here in a moment. That's a really easy one. It can take just a few minutes just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and also give folks an opportunity to share concerns if they do have any about the learning process. The next piece in terms of a practice is about connection. And so connection as a practice is about, I am here in this small group to build relationships. And so not only am I here to deliver content and information, but I am here actually purposefully to get to know these learners better. And hopefully, if we're facilitating and we're doing things that are new to us and helping us grow, we also get to build a better relationship with ourselves, right? And understanding who we are as an educator and facilitator. And so please do keep in mind that small group is an excellent modality to build connection. And so you're there not only to deliver content and to make sure learning outcomes are being addressed, but you're also there to get to know your learners better. And so it's relationship building and being strategic about that. And then the last piece, which is similar to design elements in small group facilitation, is the innovation piece. And that's where you maybe take the new solutions a step further and you ask bigger questions around a structural piece, about inequity in healthcare or, malpractice in healthcare, those sorts of like really big, tough, like sort of ethical questions. And you ask folks to innovate and say, if you were to create a new system or a new process, what would that look like? And so similar to new solutions, this is about creating new knowledge, almost like mini research projects in the scope of a small group facilitation exercise to generate new knowledge and generate new ideas. And I love that also as a facilitation practice because it gives folks an opportunity to sort of wash away some of the expectations that are traditionally attached to learning and help them be agents of their learning and share maybe potential new ideas that other folks possibly haven't thought about before. And when they do that in small groups, they build relationships with one another and also the trust necessary for good innovation to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I'm going to do a check-in with everyone. What questions do you have, or what reactions do you have so far to what I've shared? Feel free to come on video or camera. That would be excellent as well.
Okay. Okay. Looking. Okay. Oh, okay. There's a lot going on here. So I would say do a moderate amount of like small group facilitation here. Based on our curriculum is structured at CUSM, like the clinical case presentations, automatically small group, and then a lot of our clinical skills are also small group. I think one of the challenges that I sometimes have is when the students are not very engaged in the material that's being taught, I'll kind of, and it's like, I mean, there's some things that we have to teach, right? There's certain things, you try to make it fun and engaging, but at the end of the day, you need to know how to do like a specific physical exam maneuver, right? So sometimes I think, it's kind of like, how do you engage when there's a lack of interest from like the learners, in whatever the topic may be? And this is not just like, in clinical skills, I feel like it's across the board. It can sometimes be in the clinical case presentations and colloquium sessions. Like, how do you shift the energy, if that makes sense, when there's like an obvious like lack of interest in the material?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that. So let's get started with that. So my first initial reactions, number one, as faculty in particular, we need to have a healthy relationship with our leadership role in the classroom, right? It is our responsibility and opportunity to facilitate effectively and to be leaders in the classroom, okay? And so one of the ways that I like to demonstrate a healthy relationship and an equitable relationship in leadership in the classroom is I gently call in or call out, right, what's happening in the space as a way to shift the energy and to shift the focus. So the call-in process would look like this. Hey, everyone, the engagement in our classroom today or in our small group today is very low. We need to shift that right now. What suggestions do you have for us to be able to shift the energy in the room so that we can be more engaged, right? And so that's a call in that's gentle because you're not focusing on an individual student, but the group dynamic as a whole, right? Now the call out is oftentimes, and I love to do this for myself because for me, vulnerability and authenticity in the classroom or learning space is incredibly important to me because being vulnerable, being authentic allows students to do the same. Many students won't catch on to that initially, but over time they will see that that's essentially what the expectation is for them because you're modeling it yourself, right? So with that being said, the call out is, all right, students, I am not liking the lack of engagement in the classroom today, so I'm going to do something different, right? And so you tell the students, all right, I'm going to do something different. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to do an innovation exercise. We definitely have to make sure that I have a responsibility to make sure that you know how to do this physical examination correctly. But instead of me going through it and going step by step, which we'll do later, I actually want all of you to use your existing knowledge and let's use the board or Jamboard or whatever you have available to you and say, all right, I'm going to call on students one by one. And you're going to write on the board or whatever it is, the virtual or the physical board, you're going to write down one thing that you would include in the physical examination process. It doesn't have to go in logical order yet. We'll develop the logic afterwards, right? And so then you ask students, right? So you called yourself out saying you're going to do something different. You've created some sense of safety because you told the students in advance that you're going to ask them to write something on the board. And you're going to require engagement from each individual student with the expectation that it's not going to be in order. So what ends up happening there is you've created and shifted the learning environment so that students aren't so afraid to get the wrong answer. Because in most cases, I would say like 90% of the time, whether you're working with student learners or adult learners, all of us in some way, shape, or form are afraid to say the wrong thing in a group, whether it's small or large. And so as a facilitator, we have the opportunity to call ourselves out to say, I'm going to do something different and let's do it, right? And so then you prep the students for what's going to happen, similar to what I did at the beginning of this workshop, where I'm like, okay, at the very end, I'm essentially going to call on you, right? And we're going to do this, but you were prepared, so you knew, okay? So those are some initial responses that I have to your question. How do you feel about that? How does that resonate with you, or doesn't?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I actually do like that idea. I mean, I think I've tried to, because I recognize that some of the challenge might be that some things start to get repetitive in some way. So then, the students that it can be, it can feel like what is new. So I like that idea of, trying something different and kind of thinking of new ways to approach it. So even the idea of saying, hey, let's think about what are the different parts of the abdominal exam. And we're not going to, like you said, we're not going to go in order. So we're just going to talk through what are the different things you need to do when you're examining somebody's abdomen. And each person's going to say one part of it and what you'd be looking for. I like that actually. I like that a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback. And I think one thing to consider is when we're looking at providing that space for students, it's also a really good opportunity to introduce overlooked principles to maybe even the physical examination, such as CUSM's initiatives to promote equity around consent for touch, right? And so there's probably going to be students in your group who are like, you know what, I want to bring this up because there isn't a prescribed thing to me yet, right, regarding how to do this correctly, effectively. So a student hopefully is going to go on that board and say consent. And that's going to be that new piece of knowledge that maybe other students aren't accustomed to. And so now what you've done is you've just created a space for equity principles to also be introduced into the classroom, which is nice. Because as we know about our students, well, as I know about our students, they know a lot more about issues of equity and inequity in healthcare and social justice in healthcare than sometimes I do, despite the fact that I'm a professional in this area. So let's go ahead and let them be experts, in this very low key, structured sort of way.
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so we have time for one more question before we move on to the rest of the presentation.
If I can ask question, how are you doing, Dr.?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, so that's lovely. So I recently I'm facing this challenge in my group that there is like I initiate a conversation by asking a question, and there comes like one student takes the lead and they start talking about lot of opinion like here and there. So I just do not know how to stop that person, you understand, and then involve other people. I feel other people like kind of sometimes feel intimidated by them. You get my point?
Yep.
Yeah. So would you have some guidance for me? Like I really feel it like sometimes I'm just, oh my God, what should I do here?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things, and this is a question that resonates with me quite a bit, because when I started as an educator and as a small group facilitator, part of me is I want to honor just the sensitivity that other people may have around, their own awareness of are they contributing too much or not enough, right? Some people, whether they're more extroverted or just maybe the topic is of particular interest to them and they appreciate it a lot. Some people, regardless of personality style, are going to talk more in specific settings because whatever reasons, right? And so there's two things that can be done to help shift the dynamic and make it essentially more equitable, right? As far as the conversational patterns are concerned. Number one is set up the expectations for what the conversation is supposed to look like, right? At the very beginning, before you even start your discussion, right? Depending on what resonates with you, I've seen facilitators use timers, right? And that could be really effective, especially for a group where maybe one or two people have historically been dominant, because it introduces a very strong but healthy boundary around how much time a person should be spending sharing their knowledge or opinions on what we're discussing in the small group, right? And for folks who may be on the more compassionate, kind side of things, that can feel a little harsh. And so no need to start with that practice if it doesn't resonate with you. Kinder or softer approach to that practice is you can let people know, just say, all right, for today's discussion, instead of asking for volunteers, I'm going to call on you. And so in order to do that, we're going to pause for 30 seconds. Go ahead and write down or think through some of the thoughts or ideas you have about this question. And then I'm going to time myself for 30 seconds, and then we're going to go ahead and get started, right? And so then the students, once again, are prepared that you're going to call on them. And then you can facilitate this discussion that way by maybe starting with individuals who historically maybe haven't participated in as much in the small groups before, right? So those are two examples among many that I can share with you, but those are two that come to mind right now.
I love it. So alarm is going to be a little bit harsh on my side.
Yes, yes.
I'm too soft to alarm, but the other idea is excellent, that I'm going to call on you and take your 30 seconds to write down your thoughts.
Mhm.
That is going to be very helpful. Then everybody knows that they're going to be participating and contributing in the conversation.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to share my screen once more, and we will continue with our workshop presentation in just a few moments. All right, so let's move on to the next part. Okay, so the next section is actually a place, this is kind of where my heart sings as far as small group facilitation is concerned. And this is the internal experience for the facilitator. So these are the things that you can do that are internal to you, your cognition, your behaviors, your attitudes, your beliefs, and your values around small group facilitation. And so I just refer to these generally as facilitation techniques. So prior, those were facilitation practices, the outward, and then facilitation techniques. I just use that to differentiate between the two, and those are the inward, right? What we do as facilitators to do this work effectively. So I put this first for a reason, storytelling. Storytelling is one of my favorite ways to facilitate engagement and ongoing learning in small groups. So storytelling, especially stories that evoke emotional connection to the material, allow participants to internalize and remember material with greater ease. One of the struggles, especially for basic scientists or biomedical scientists, is, storytelling doesn't really have a place because we're introducing objective knowledge. And in many ways, I would agree. You're absolutely right. There isn't going to be a place for storytelling in everything that we do or teach. But let's go back to the physical examination example. Let's say you're an individual who is newer to equity practices around consent for physical touch. And, as you started learning about those equity practices, you realize you made a mistake in the past. And so here you are introducing a very objective, protocol associated with physical examination, right? That has been standardized and is based in sound science. And you still could share a story there. You could talk about a time where you interacted with a patient, right? Without revealing their information and who they are, and keep the story general enough so that no one can identify who that person is. And you could say, here's where I made a mistake. And so all of a sudden you've introduced a moment of authenticity and vulnerability so that students understand the importance, the vital importance of doing physical examinations correctly, right? And so storytelling has its place. I feel my bias is that storytelling has a place in every element of education, regardless of where knowledge falls on maybe more subjective or more objective, right? In fact, for someone like me, I don't really fall into those categories, that knowledge is knowledge and it's a bit broader than that. But for many folks, there is objective knowledge. And I do believe objective knowledge exists in many ways, especially in medicine. So storytelling can be a great way, right? Synthesizing information is what happens internally. This is the ability for the facilitator to connect otherwise divergent ideas into themes, demonstrate to the participants, that knowledge comes from organization and logic. So going back to the example that was shared earlier, maybe you are doing that, you are helping students learn how to do a physical examination correctly. And students had put onto the virtual whiteboard or the classroom, whiteboard, just kind of, their information or their thoughts on what has to be included in the physical examination. Your job and opportunity as a facilitator is to see everything jumbled up on that board and then to start creating it or moving it towards a logical, thoughtful, scientific-based pattern, right? And so synthesizing information is a really great skill for facilitators to have. And it's almost an essential skill because there's going to be times where, two people are talking supposedly about the same thing or responding to the same facilitation question that you asked, but they're coming from way different perspectives. And so over time, you'll learn to say, okay, what is the connection between these two divergent perspectives? Instead of saying, I don't see a connection, a good facilitator says, what is the connection between these two divergent perspectives? And that's something that takes a long time to develop. So this is an area where maybe you introduce it little by little into your own practice. One of the ways that I like to practice synthesizing information is when I'm in meetings, right, professionally, and I listen and I'm hearing people talking about, something completely maybe outside of my area of expertise, and which is often, and I'll sort of say, okay, what dots can I connect here? And so part of my process as an educator is sitting in those meetings, actively listening and beginning to connect the dots. And then, if it makes sense, I may follow up with folks or even in the same meeting and just say, here's what I got from the meeting. Is that correct? And then typically I receive feedback that says, well, no, it was actually this, or yes, you're right on point. And so practicing synthesizing can happen in the classroom space, but it can also happen in other spaces. And the beauty of that, it's internal. You don't necessarily have to tell anyone that you're doing that. And I won't tell anyone that you're doing that if you watch this or took this workshop. And you can just practice it, right? And it's a really great way to build your skill set over time. So connecting is another technique. Facilitators have an opportunity to connect people to one another through small group facilitation by highlighting similarities in perspectives and experiences. And so this is particularly crucial when maybe we're discussing like ethical issues in medicine or equity and justice issues in medicine. And so building connections and saying, what I'm noticing here is that even though both of you shared two very different stories, I'm seeing that there's actually a shared common thing. Both of you, although coming from different perspectives, struggled with the same idea of how to do X, right? And so connecting the dots for people by looking at the similarities, it's a little bit different than synthesizing, because synthesizing is creating logic out of ideas that are divergent, but connecting is building connections between people that may result in stronger rapport and relationships by connecting people's experiences and perceptions together, right? So that's the key there. Honoring is another really powerful internal facilitation technique. It's incredibly powerful to validate the experiences of participants and accept those experiences as truth, especially experiences regarding gender, racial, and other forms of injustice, right? And so when people talk about, sometimes they're painful or difficult or inequitable experiences being a medical student or being a woman physician, whatever it might be, those experiences will come up from time to time in the classroom. And even though you may not necessarily know how to respond to the situation because it may be new to you, or maybe it's just overwhelming, right? You can, regardless of the circumstances, you can honor a person always and say, I really appreciate the fact that you brought that up. That was incredibly brave and courageous of you. I'm gonna use that and I'm gonna reflect on that. I'm gonna think about that. I don't have an answer for you right now, but it's important enough to me, or you're important enough to me for me to spend some time with it, right? And so those are ways that you can honor a person's experience, right? Even if you don't know how to respond to it, or maybe you want to jump, maybe you're a fixer and you're like, oh, I just want to make everyone comfortable again. I just want to fix the situation. I want to make it better for the learner or the student. You don't have to do that. And in fact, sometimes that causes more harm than it does good. Instead, you can honor them and just say, you're courageous for doing that. And I really appreciate that. I see that, okay? So a couple more techniques are encouraging, right? Through thoughtful pauses and using multiple ways to engage participants, multiple ways to engage, participants should be encouraged to share. Some of the ways that you can do that is through online surveys, Jamboards. We use Slido a lot as part of the EIDP programming. Post-its, or the virtual version is the Jamboard, anonymous Q&As through Slido, chats, and more. And so sometimes when facilitation is really difficult, and you're noticing that maybe even still, regardless of you implementing new practices or techniques, the students or the learners still aren't engaging. So use some of these other modalities to encourage it, right? And whenever necessary, set up the hope or the expectation that that's what they're going to do. And over time, the behavior and that the energy of the room or the small group will shift, okay? But encourage folks to participate in whatever way they can, right? That's very important. Going back to the example where students are maybe given 30 seconds to reflect on what they want to share, one of the ways that I like to encourage students is oftentimes initially when we're thinking through some of our thoughts, we don't necessarily always think in full sentences. And so one of the ways I can encourage a student in that situation to engage is to say, hey, oftentimes in these situations when we're writing down our initial reflections, don't worry about sharing full sentences with us. You can just share quick bullet points or even just words that came up for you. And so that's a way to sort of scaffold the experience so that students can participate, and you're encouraging them to do so while simultaneously reducing the pressure that's associated with being perceived as perfect or correct or knowledgeable, right? Because all of us fumble. So we might as well just be very transparent and thoughtful about that process. Another way is reframing. When participants share information that may be incomplete or inaccurate, facilitators can use that information to add or change the narrative as needed. And so let's say participants share information that is incomplete or inaccurate. One of the best ways that you can lean into that process is ask them, where did you learn that from? Sometimes it's misinformation that was given to them at the undergraduate level. Sometimes it's misinformation that was given to them by our peers and colleagues. That happens, we're human, and that's okay. And so first, investigate, okay, where is this person's perception or understanding of this content coming from? And then you could say, all right, I'm very grateful that you shared that with me because that gives me perspective on why you thought that was true. I'd like to go ahead and add on to that, or actually to shift our perspective and use this as a learning opportunity for us. And so then you can correct the person while honoring just their general humanity, right, and their personhood. And then, right, going back into the larger small group and just saying, all right, here's the truthful information about the situation, right? And so that's a really gentle and kind way to reframe. That's why I call it that. And that's why it's often called that in the literature. Reframe, right? Acknowledge why or how a person knows what they know, but then don't be afraid to use your leadership as a facilitator or a faculty member to then shift the conversation so that everyone has the correct knowledge and information. Okay. So we're coming back to our exercise now, and we have, I think, the perfect amount of time to be able to do this. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, I requested that you write down some examples, questions, previous struggles, concerns, learning goals that you have for yourself as a faculty member, maybe hopes that you have for small group facilitation, and we're going to go ahead and discuss them now. So I'm going to stop the presentation one more time. We're going to come as a small group together, and if possible, please come on camera and video. I forgot to mention that at the beginning, but I think we have a really good group here, so I'd love folks to be on camera if possible, because it replicates kind of the real world small group facilitation. So go ahead and do that if you feel comfortable, and let's go ahead and get started. What questions, struggles, hopes do you have? What came up for you in this workshop that I could facilitate with you right now? Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Lu, for coming on camera. Thank you, Dr. Danian. Appreciate it. Okay, who wants to get us started? Thank you, Dr. Schwartz.
Oh, well, I mean, I'll let somebody else talk. Somebody else wants something to say, but I am.
So I had the same question that Dr. Danian expressed before about how do you increase engagement, but from the techniques that you were sharing, one of them I struggle with still, and that's the reframing when students have incomplete or just outright incorrect information, especially once you get to topics that maybe are not part of our curriculum necessarily. There's so much anger and opinion out there these days that how do you when you run up against topics that people have very strong opinions about, how is reframing used in that situation?
Yeah. So this is a really great question. So in fact, what I would do to answer this question is I would introduce a new technique, which is addressing harm, right? And so it's a more advanced, potentially, form of reframing, right? And so we do have folks who have very, very strong opinions, often incorrect, or rather the way that I like to frame it is harmful opinions about other people, cultures, their identities, their experiences, harmful opinions about how medicine should be practiced. Sometimes that harm comes in the form of the actual opinion being stated in the space, or sometimes the harm comes in just the fact that they're resisting, right, information and knowledge to replace old knowledge with, right? So regardless of how the harm is, the practice or the technique is let's address the harm. And so depending on how much psychological safety or how much rapport that you have with your learners, you want to interject as soon as possible, right? And so you can do that initially 2 ways. Way number one is this. You can say, I'm noticing your very strong reaction to what we're discussing today. With your permission, I'd like for us to spend some time with that and to really talk about that a little bit more. Here's what I'd like to do as a group. I'd like for us to discuss what is the purpose of this opinion being shared? Why is it important to you as the learner? How come you brought that up in this space? Because first and foremost, as your faculty member or facilitator, I want to know why that matters to you, right? And so you begin your reframe or you begin addressing the harm by first understanding. Because the last thing that we want to do is use harm to stop harm, right? Because we want to model for people that you can stop harm while still being humanizing, right? And so with that being said, just say, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what I'm noticing. We're going to pause and we're going to talk about it, right? Because, some people are really hesitant to do that because maybe you're the type of educator or facilitator where you have a list of objectives that you have to accomplish that day because there's limited time. But here's the key thing that you have to grapple with as a faculty member. You have 2 options. Either you stay strict to your agenda, knowing that you have whatever requirements that you have to fulfill, or you pause your agenda and mend the harm or begin to address the harm, knowing that if you do it, it may prevent that from happening somewhere else, right? And so that's key. So you just have to make a decision, a professional decision, what works for you as a faculty member. The other way to address the harm then is also about, I'm going to call it harm, call it what it is, right? When we have these ideas or these perceptions or these opinions, it causes harm to people, right? If you feel vulnerable enough in the classroom or want to introduce that type of vulnerability, you could even say, here's how your comment harmed me, right? Or here's how your comment caused harm for me. And that's a really, really great way to sort of just even out the playing field almost immediately, and to let people know that you're willing to be vulnerable and courageous enough to address that comment caused harm to you, right? You don't always necessarily have to be quote unquote the objective facilitator. You can still be objective, but thoughtful and include your humanity in the process if it's directly relevant to what's being said, right? And so that's crucial. So just to recap, number one, pausing, right? And saying, there's a dynamic going on here. We need to investigate this. I want to understand more. Tell me more about why you feel that way or think that way. And then after that, call it what it is. This is causing harm for our students, our participants, larger groups of people that we care about, as a school of medicine, for example, and then begin to just have that conversation, right? The IDP office, all of us, Dr. Lu's on the call today, me, Dr. Lu, and Dr. Nakai are skilled in that type of facilitation in very different ways. So I would imagine if you were to reach out to any of us and we have some time available, we could actually go more into depth in that with you, if we have that capacity. But my observation of our team is that each of us knows how to do that incredibly well, and we do it a little bit differently, which actually could be a benefit, for your ongoing professional learning. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Can I ask another question? I know that we're almost out of time, and so if it's fine if we want to pass or on this or anything, but it's related because you were talking about kind of a certain kind of communication that may come up in a small group. I'm curious about a different kind but related, and that is dealing with feelings of outrage, because there's so much outrage in our discourse that often I've discovered in my own students that can spill over. Doesn't often spill over in vitriolic ways in the classroom, but sometimes. Mm-hmm. And when we're discussing and having a conversation, and there are these really elevated emotional responses, they're not necessarily harmful, but rather expressive of expressing anger at something. I'm curious how to acknowledge and reframe and not let that get away from you. I'm curious to hear you speak about maybe a strategy or a tactic to use to keep those controlled while honoring the sentiment that's there and appropriately contextualizing it.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. So I'll respond to it using a story. So for me, as a facilitator, educator, and even just as a leader, professional, colleague, peer, there are times, multiple times a week, I would say, where I have an elevated reaction to the things that are happening around me. And my elevated reaction is due to a lot of things. Maybe the plan that I had in my head isn't happening, right? Because I'm not practicing flexibility with the people around me. Sometimes that strong emotional reaction is, oh my goodness, a student or a colleague said something harmful or inappropriate. And so now I'm elevated in my reaction, right? And, when we think about that, and when we translate some of those things into facilitation, what I try to do is I reflect on those experiences as often as I can. I keep a professional journal, right? I have a personal journal for my personal life, and then I have a professional journal that I use to reflect on my practices as a leader. And whenever possible, I write into that journal, a date or an example or a story of when I had a strong reaction to something, right? And then the next piece that I do is I say, there wasn't anyone to help me there with that reaction, right? I sort of had to do that for myself. So then I asked myself, what did I do for me? Well, number one, I paused and I gave myself some time to breathe if I could do that. Sometimes we can't always do that. Sometimes it's, all right, I'm going to just notice that I'm having a strong reaction. I don't necessarily need to resolve it or solve it right now, but eventually, I'm going to encourage myself to reflect on it later, right? And so as you think about those strong reactions in the classroom, you want to translate those tools or those techniques to the students. So 3 things come to mind. The pause once again and saying, hey, there are elevated emotional responses in the space right now, which, I want you to know aren't bad, right? We're talking about something really difficult. So it is to be expected that folks would have strong emotions around this, and that's okay. So let's go ahead and take, a 30-second pause. You can breathe, you can just write about this, you can, just ruminate on it, whatever makes sense to the person, and just take 30 seconds to ask yourself, what is going on for me? What is this for me? What's happening? Another practice that you could use is say, and if you feel comfortable, you could say, let's talk about the strong emotions now. And here are some parameters around that. Use I statements, okay? And talk about your experience and your emotion. Do not blame. No one else is responsible for your emotional reaction, right? Even if a person did cause harm in the space, your emotions are valuable and important to you. And our discussion is intended to make them valuable and important for all of us, right? We want to honor you and your strong reactions whenever possible, right? And so, and then another piece is, okay, we're experiencing these strong emotions and I don't know what to do. And it's okay to, if you feel comfortable, right, to let your learners know, this is a new place for me and I don't know what to do. Does anyone have any suggestions on how we can move forward, right? And so, because it's okay not to know, right? And especially when we're learning small group facilitation for the first time, or we're newer to it, or even we've been doing it for a while and maybe we're just trying something new, right? We're experiencing something we never had before. Go ahead and ease the tension by saying, I don't know. And following that up with, let's figure it out together, right? Really powerful in that small group setting. So those are some examples that come up for me as based on your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so we are at time. Any final thoughts or words that folks would like to share before we end? Thanks, Dr. Liu, for the hand clap. Appreciate it. Okay.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry. Real quick, I am putting in a feedback survey link into the chat. If you could just do me a favor, I know that everyone has meetings to get to, but if you could just go there real quick and it'll take like 20 seconds. and at least pull it up on your computer so that it's there for later if you have to go somewhere. So I appreciate that. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.